Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's most dangerous myth is their Hollywood reputation as heroic outlaws. The truth behind the Wild Bunch is that they were violent thieves who blew $30,000 in stolen payrolls on Fort Worth casinos and brothels. Their extreme vanity led them to pose for a studio portrait, which the Pinkerton agency immediately used to hunt them across the globe. Driven into South American exile by massive bounties, they met a brutal, unglamorous end, bleeding out in a Bolivian shootout and rotting in an unmarked grave. Robert Leroy Parker did not invent train robbery, but he industrialized it. Born in 1866 in Beaver, Utah, to a devout, impoverished Mormon family, Parker spent his formative years performing grueling manual labor on cattle ranches and in butcher shops. He learned early that honest, back-breaking work yielded nothing but physical deterioration and perpetual debt. He watched massive cattle syndicates and railroad monopolies dictate the terms of existence for the working class. When he crossed the threshold into criminality, adopting the alias Butch Cassidy, he brought with him an acute understanding of the frontier's economic and social hierarchies. The era of the chaotic brute force outlaw, men who rode into town screaming, firing wildly, and leaving a trail of civilian casualties, was ending. The state and the corporations had developed sophisticated, heavily armed responses to such tactics. Parker recognized that survival required a fundamental shift in methodology. He approached robbery as a complex corporate enterprise. A successful strike against a fortified Union Pacific train or a regional bank was not merely a matter of dynamite and drawn revolvers. It was an exercise in extreme logistics. To execute a robbery and subsequently vanish across the unforgiving terrain of the Rocky Mountains, the Wild Bunch required an uninterrupted supply chain. They needed fresh, high-quality relay horses stationed every 10 to 15 miles. They needed safe houses for rest and medical attention. Above all, they needed absolute silence from the local population. To cross the vast expanses between their hideouts in hole-in-the-wall Browns Park and Robbers Roost faster than the telegraph wires could transmit their location, Parker had to build a network of complicity. Bypassing crude intimidation tactics, he engineered this network entirely through calculated psychological manipulation. Parker engineered the persona of the gentleman bandit, a carefully curated image designed to exploit the deep-seated grievances of the rural poor. His primary weapon was his demeanor. Parker was stocky, square-jawed, and possessed a perpetual disarming smile. He dressed immaculately, often adopting the attire of a successful ranch owner or a regional businessman. He was universally described as polite, affable, and quick to laugh. He strictly forbade his men from mistreating women or engaging in unnecessary violence during robberies. He operated on the principle that a man looking down the barrel of a Colt revolver is far more likely to open a safe if the man holding the gun speaks to him with calm, respectful authority rather than frantic aggression. This affability extended to his logistical operations. When Parker and his men rode through the isolated valleys of Utah and Wyoming, they deliberately targeted the struggling farms of Mormon families and destitute ranchers. A typical interaction was highly choreographed. Parker would arrive at a weathered cabin, tip his expensive hat to the farmer's wife, and politely request a hot meal and a fresh relay of horses. The farmer, acutely aware of the heavily armed men standing in his yard, was already operating under a state of implicit duress. But Parker did not take the horses by force. After the meal, as the gang prepared to mount their fresh mounts, Parker would reach into his pocket and place a $20 double eagle gold coin on the rough wooden table. The market value for the meal and the rental of the horses was a mere fraction of that amount. To a farmer facing foreclosure from a corporate bank, a $20 gold piece was a lifeline. It was the difference between surviving the winter and starvation. The farmer would take the coin. Parker would smile, offer his thanks, and ride away into the canyons, leaving his exhausted, sweat-lathered horses behind. The dime novels and the local press, eager to sell papers, romanticized these transactions. They branded Butch Cassidy a frontier Robin Hood, a man who stole from the wealthy syndicates and shared his spoils with the common people. The public, desperate for a champion against the monopolies, eagerly consumed the myth. They began to view the Wild Bunch not as violent criminals, but as a mechanism of economic vengeance. The forensic reality of Parker's generosity was purely transactional. The gold coin placed on the table was not an act of frontier charity. It was the calculated transfer of legal liability. By accepting stolen federal currency, the isolated farmer crossed a definitive legal threshold, becoming an accessory after the fact. Parker understood a ruthless equation. A population legally complicit in your crimes cannot inform on you without destroying themselves. The true cost of Parker's smile manifested days later when heavily armed Pinkerton detectives arrived. They did not view the farmer as a struggling pioneer, but as a conspirator. Under brutal, unregulated interrogation and the threat of federal prison, the farmer realized the trap. Betray the Wild Bunch and face assassination, or remain silent and lose his farm to the state. Parker had weaponized rural poverty, using destitute citizens as disposable human shields to absorb the legal and physical trauma of the state's retaliation while he escaped. The most glaring proof that Robert Leroy Parker viewed his criminal enterprise as a corporate structure rather than a romanticized rebellion occurred in early 1900, mere months before the disastrous Fort Worth photograph was taken. Parker recognized that the relentless expansion of the Pinkerton apparatus and the increasing militarization of railroad security were mathematically unsustainable for the Wild Bunch. He did not want to die in a shootout. He wanted to cash out his equity and retire. In a move of staggering, unprecedented audacity, Parker attempted to execute a hostile legal buyout of his own criminal record. He initiated back-channel, highly confidential negotiations with the sitting governor of Utah, Heber Wells, and the executive board of the Union Pacific Railroad. Parker utilized a prominent defense attorney, Douglas Preston, as his corporate liaison. The terms Parker proposed were clinical and transactional. He offered a complete, permanent cessation of all hostilities against the Union Pacific and regional banks. In exchange, he demanded a full, unconditional gubernatorial pardon for his past offenses, effectively wiping his ledger clean and allowing him to integrate into the legitimate economy with his accumulated stolen wealth. The Union Pacific executives, bleeding capital from the constant robberies and the exorbitant fees paid to the Pinkertons, seriously entertained the proposal. They viewed Parker not as a moral failing, but as a severe logistical liability that was cheaper to pardon than to hunt. A clandestine meeting was actually scheduled to take place in the remote Utah wilderness. to finalize the terms of this extraordinary amnesty agreement. However, this unprecedented attempt to merge the criminal underworld with state-sanctioned immunity was catastrophically aborted. Just days before the scheduled negotiation, a separate, unaffiliated faction of outlaws, operating without Parker's authorization but utilizing the logistical infrastructure of the Wild Bunch, executed a massive, highly violent robbery against a Union Pacific train at Tipton, Wyoming. The railroad executives and the Utah governor, furious and assuming Parker had acted in extreme bad faith, immediately and permanently terminated the amnesty negotiations. This specific historical failure completely dismantled Parker's exit strategy. He had attempted to use his stolen capital and the threat of future violence to leverage the state into granting him legal legitimacy, proving that his ultimate goal was never to dismantle the capitalist system, but simply to secure a comfortable position within it. When the negotiations collapsed, the corporate patience of the Union Pacific evaporated. The railroad transitioned from seeking a negotiated settlement to authorizing unlimited funding for the absolute physical termination of the Wild Bunch, setting the stage for the global relentless hunt that would eventually corner Parker in South America. The urban center of Fort Worth, Texas, at the turn of the 20th century, was a geographical anomaly. It served as a massive transit hub where the brutal, dust-choked reality of the cattle trails collided with the opulent, electrified wealth of the Gilded Age. At the southern edge of the city lay a sprawling multi-block precinct known officially as the Third Ward and colloquially as Hell's Half Acre. It was a dense concentration of high-end casinos, elegant brothels, and saloons outfitted with imported mahogany bars and brass rail fittings. It was an environment engineered to extract capital rapidly and efficiently. For the executive core of the Wild Bunch, flush with tens of thousands of dollars in stolen federal banknotes and Union Pacific gold, Fort Worth was not a hiding place. It was a destination for aggressive, unchecked consumption. The physical extraction of capital from a Union Pacific Express car represented only the initial kinetic phase of the Wild Bunch's corporate enterprise. The secondary, far more complex operational challenge was achieving liquidity. When Parker's syndicate detonated the safe during the Wilcox train robbery in 1899, they acquired roughly $30,000. However, a significant portion of this haul did not consist of untraceable gold bullion. It consisted of thick stacks of pristine, unsigned national banknotes. In their unendorsed state, these bills were functionally worthless, dead corporate paper that would immediately trigger a federal arrest if presented to any legitimate merchant or territorial bank. To wash their unusable loot, Parker's gang shifted from brute force robbery to meticulous forgery. Hidden in remote canyons, they carefully forged bank signatures onto thousands of stolen banknotes. Yet, this paper remained a deadly liability. The Pinkerton agency had already flagged the consecutive serial numbers across the national banking grid, making every bill a potential trap. To permanently clean this highly toxic capital, the Wild Bunch required a high-volume, unregulated laundering apparatus. This specific financial necessity explains exactly why this syndicate frequently migrated from the isolated frontier to dense, vice-ridden urban centers like Hell's Half Acre in Fort Worth. They deliberately injected the serialized, forged banknotes into the chaotic, cash-heavy economies of high-stakes casinos, saloons, and brothels. By systematically betting the hot paper at the faro tables and cashing out their winnings, they were able to seamlessly exchange the traceable corporate notes for untraceable gold double eagles and silver coinage. They were effectively washing stolen federal currency through the underground vice economy. This forensic reality entirely dismantles the myth of the rugged, simple frontier outlaw. Parker was commanding a highly organized money laundering syndicate, actively utilizing the exact same financial obfuscation protocols employed by modern transnational cartels to integrate illicit capital into the legitimate global market. In the late autumn of 1900, Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh arrived in the city, accompanied by the most lethal operatives of their syndicate: Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry, Ben Kilpatrick, the Tall Texan, and Will Carver. They had recently executed a flawless strike against a corporate train, evaporating into the landscape before the railroad security forces could even mobilize. They possessed a surplus of stolen wealth and an absolute toxic surplus of arrogance. They did not retreat to the isolated canyons of Utah to secure their funds. They checked into luxury hotels in Fort Worth. They discarded their trail-worn canvas and leather. They visited the city's premier tailors, ordering bespoke three-piece suits of fine worsted wool and imported silk. They purchased high-starched collars, expensive silk cravats, and immaculate stiff-brimmed derby hats. They adorned their waistcoats with heavy, solid gold pocket watches and diamond stick pins. This extreme sartorial transformation was not merely a matter of vanity, it was a psychological declaration. By adopting the exact uniform of the railroad executives and bank managers they routinely terrorized, they were mocking the establishment. They were demonstrating that the violent extraction of capital from the frontier could purchase entry into the highest tiers of urban luxury. They believed their intelligence and their heavily armed network rendered them untouchable. This collective narcissism reached its critical mass on a specific afternoon when the five men walked off the bustling street and entered the commercial photography studio of John Swartz. Abandoning any practical need for forged travel documents or mapped routes, they visited the studio entirely for their own narcissistic amusement. They arranged themselves in front of Swartz's heavy wooden-framed camera. Parker sat on the right, his trademark affable smile firmly in place, radiating the calm authority of a corporate chairman. Longabaugh sat casually on the left, his features sharp and unreadable. Behind them stood Logan, Carver, and Kilpatrick, their tailored suits fitting perfectly over the heavy, customized Colt revolvers concealed beneath their coats. The photographer loaded the glass plate negative, ignited the magnesium flash powder, and captured the image. It was a photograph of five men who believed they had successfully conquered the American West. They paid Swartz for several cabinet card prints, likely intending to use them as private, inside jokes to distribute among their trusted network of informants and safe house operators. They then walked out of the studio and returned to the faro tables and the brothels of Hell's Half Acre, entirely unaware that the brief flash of magnesium powder was the catalyst for their absolute destruction. John Swartz recognized the exceptional quality of the portrait. The subjects were strikingly well dressed, their postures conveying a unique, relaxed confidence. Seeking to advertise the fidelity of his lens and his skill with lighting, Swartz placed a pristine print of the five gentlemen prominently in the glass display window of his studio facing the busy Fort Worth street. The men in the photograph had spent years operating as ghosts. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, heavily funded by E.H. Harriman and the Union Pacific Railroad, had compiled thick dossiers on the Wild Bunch, detailing their methods, their estimated heights, and their suspected associates. But the Pinkertons lacked the most critical piece of intelligence: accurate, high-resolution facial identification. The detectives were hunting shadows. Weeks after the photograph was taken, a detective, acting either as a Pinkerton operative or a local lawman coordinating with the agency, walked down the street and paused at Swartz's display window. He looked at the portrait of the five well-dressed businessmen. He recognized the face of Will Carver from a previous minor arrest record. He then scrutinized the other four faces, cross-referencing them against the physical descriptions in the agency's files. The realization was immediate and catastrophic for the syndicate. The detective walked into the studio, seized the photograph, and expedited it directly to the Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. When William Pinkerton, the director of the agency, examined the glass plate print, he possessed the holy grail of 19th century law enforcement. The Outlaws had voluntarily provided the state with a perfectly lit, sharply focused group portrait. The Pinkerton agency immediately militarized the photograph. They utilized high-speed printing presses to reproduce the image thousands of times. The portrait was stripped of its elegant studio context and plastered onto the center of federal wanted posters. These posters were bundled and loaded onto the very train lines the Wild Bunch preyed upon. Within weeks, the faces of Parker, Longabaugh, Logan, Kilpatrick, and Carver were staring back from the bulletin boards of every post office, sheriff's department, railway station, and saloon from the Mexican border to the Canadian line. Below the photograph, the syndicates printed the bounties. The Union Pacific, the express companies, and the territorial governors pooled their resources, authorizing a staggering financial package for the capture or termination of the men in the picture. The aggregate bounty for the five individuals fluctuated, but it represented a collective valuation of tens of thousands of dollars, a sum so massive it effectively destabilized the entire social geometry of the frontier. Operating far outside the jurisdiction of standard federal law enforcement, the transcontinental pursuit of the Wild Bunch functioned explicitly as the execution of a private, heavily capitalized corporate contract. In the late 1890s, local sheriffs and federal marshals were jurisdictionally bound, severely underfunded, and frequently susceptible to local loyalties or outright bribery. Recognizing this state-level impotence, the major industrial monopolies, specifically the Union Pacific Railroad, the American Bankers Association, and the major express shipping syndicates, formed an unprecedented, heavily militarized financial consortium. They pooled massive, unregulated reserves of corporate capital to retain the Pinkerton National Detective Agency on a continuous, open-ended subscription model. This financial architecture completely privatized the American justice system. Unrestrained by constitutional due process, extradition treaties, or county lines, the Pinkerton operatives deployed as a highly lethal, borderless mercenary force directly accountable only to the corporate shareholders who funded their deployments. When Parker orchestrated the detonation of a Union Pacific safe, he was not merely committing a localized felony. He was triggering a massive, pre-funded corporate algorithm designed to systematically track and annihilate market liabilities. The consortium provided the agency with a bottomless black budget, effectively removing any financial constraints from the manhunt. Pinkerton detectives could legally board any train, cross any state or international border, and utilize unrestricted interrogation tactics without requesting state authorization. This systemic privatization of lethal force guaranteed a mathematically insurmountable disadvantage for the syndicate. The Wild Bunch could never simply outrun the law because the law had been entirely bypassed. They were attempting to outrun the combined limitless liquid capital of the American Industrial Revolution, an entity that could afford to hunt them relentlessly until their physical termination was confirmed. The publication of the Fort Worth 5 photograph instantly neutralized Parker's carefully constructed logistical network. The $20 gold coins he had used to buy the silence of impoverished ranchers were suddenly rendered meaningless against the prospect of a multi-thousand-dollar federal reward. Loyalty in the criminal underworld is a commodity, and the Pinkertons had just outbid the Wild Bunch by a catastrophic margin. The psychological environment of the syndicate inverted overnight. The bespoke worsted wool suits and the derby hats no longer functioned as camouflage. They were high-visibility targets. The men could no longer walk into a saloon in Texas or a hotel in Wyoming without scrutinizing the eyes of the bartender or the desk clerk, waiting to see the flash of recognition. Every drifting cowboy, every corrupt local deputy they had previously bribed, and every former accomplice was now a potential assassin waiting for them to turn their backs. The tight, disciplined unit that had successfully paralyzed the regional rail network began to fracture under the crushing weight of paranoia. They could no longer sleep in the same location for consecutive nights. They slept with their revolvers drawn, terrified that the men guarding the perimeter were calculating the exchange rate of their lives. The photograph had stripped them of their anonymity, and the bounty had stripped them of their allies. The hunters had been perfectly, efficiently transformed into the hunted, forced to run, not from a single sheriff, but from an entire population, mathematically incentivized to kill them. The United States had contracted into a lethal, heavily monitored grid. By the winter of 1901, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, fueled by the limitless capital of the Union Pacific Railroad, had saturated the American West with the Fort Worth photograph. The faces of Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh were pinned to the wooden boards of every train depot, post office, and sheriff's station from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. The bounty had weaponized the civilian population. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Any rancher or bartender was a potential assassin calculating the exchange rate of a federal reward. Recognizing that physical survival was mathematically impossible within the borders of the United States, the executive core of the Wild Bunch made a calculated decision to evaporate. Eschewing a desperate, moonlit ride across the Mexican border, their escape unfolded as a methodical, heavily funded corporate relocation. In early 1901, Parker, Longabaugh, and Longabaugh's companion, Etta Place, traveled to New York City. Avoiding the shadows of the Bowery entirely, They utilized their stolen federal banknotes to seamlessly integrate themselves into the highest echelons of urban society. They purchased tailored European suits, expensive luggage, and fine jewelry. They patronized upscale restaurants and attended the theater, hiding in plain sight among the industrial barons of Manhattan. When they boarded the British steamer Herminius on February 20th, 1901, bound for Buenos Aires, they walked up the gangplank not as hunted fugitives but as wealthy expatriates. They registered on the ship's manifest under the aliases James Ryan, Harry A. Place, and Ethel Place. As the steamer navigated past the Statue of Liberty and into the Atlantic, the physical distance from the Pinkerton headquarters expanded, but the psychological tether remained intact. Argentina offered a vast, unpoliced frontier that mirrored the American West of a decade prior. Disembarking in Buenos Aires, they deposited their stolen American gold into regional banks, established lines of credit, and traveled deep into the remote Chubut province of Patagonia. They purchased a sprawling 15,000-acre tract of land in the Colila Valley, nestled against the foothills of the Andes. This specific acquisition in the Colila Valley functioned as a highly orchestrated exploitation of foreign geopolitical policy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, following a brutal military campaign known as the Conquest of the Desert, the Argentine government was aggressively privatizing vast, newly cleared territories in Patagonia. To rapidly establish a capitalist agricultural baseline and secure the frontier, the state offered massive, heavily subsidized land grants, specifically targeting white, North American, and European immigrants. Parker and Longabaugh recognized a profound systemic loophole. They utilized the thousands of dollars violently extracted from the Union Pacific Railroad to directly finance a state-sponsored land grab in South America. By securing this massive estate, they did not just buy a farm, they seamlessly integrated themselves into the elite Argentine oligarchy. The forensic irony of this transaction is absolute and devastating. The men who had built their entire criminal mythology in the United States by supposedly fighting against wealthy cattle syndicates and monopolistic land barons had instantly transformed into the exact same oppressive demographic. Operating under their assumed names, they became massive corporate landlords on the Patagonian frontier. They employed local impoverished peons at strict subsistence wages to manage their herds, amassed massive capital on land seized from indigenous populations, and operated with the full legal and administrative protection of the Argentine state. They utilized their stolen American corporate funds to purchase absolute systemic power in a foreign nation. The carefully curated illusion of the frontier Robin Hood was permanently destroyed in the high plains of Chubut. They proved definitively that their violent rebellion in the American West was never driven by a loyalty to the working class or a desire to dismantle the monopolies. It was driven strictly by an overwhelming desire to accumulate enough capital to become the monopoly themselves. For 4 years, they aggressively manufactured an illusion of legitimacy. They built a substantial 4-room log cabin with a durable zinc roof. They purchased hundreds of head of cattle, horses, and sheep. Parker, operating as James Ryan, utilized his genuine expertise in livestock management to build a highly functional ranching operation. They hosted local dignitaries, including the deputy governor of the territory, serving them imported tea and fine whiskey. At a place, an elegant and stabilizing presence maintained the domestic facade, projecting the image of a respectable pioneer family. They were attempting to buy their way out of their own history, using the capital violently extracted from Wyoming train cars to purchase a quiet, pastoral existence at the bottom of the world. But the machinery of corporate vengeance operates on a global axis. The Pinkerton Agency did not close its files when the trail went cold in New York. William Pinkerton recognized that the volume of money stolen required access to major financial institutions. The agency began a systematic audit of international banking transfers and shipping manifests. The breakthrough occurred not through brilliant detective work, but through the fatal arrogance of the outlaws themselves. Before leaving the United States, Parker and Longabaugh had maintained correspondence with family members and former associates using intermediaries. The Pinkertons intercepted these communications, tracing the geographic origin of the letters back to Buenos Aires. The ghost of the Fort Worth photograph crossed the equator. The Pinkertons dispatched Frank DiMaio, one of their most relentless and capable operatives, to South America. DiMaio was not a frontier sheriff. He was a highly educated, multilingual corporate investigator. He arrived in Buenos Aires carrying a satchel filled with Spanish-language wanted posters, featuring the high-resolution faces of the Wild Bunch. DiMaio systematically dismantled the Outlaws' Patagonian illusion. He did not need to ride into the Cholila Valley and engage in a gunfight. He simply walked into the central banks, the shipping offices, and the regional police headquarters of Buenos Aires. He distributed the posters and the staggering bounty figures to the Argentine authorities. The local police, highly motivated by the financial reward, quickly identified the wealthy American expatriates James Ryan and Harry Place as the internationally wanted fugitives. The telegraph wires humming across the Argentine pampas carried the exact coordinates of the Shalila Ranch. The psychological devastation of this discovery was absolute. Parker and Longabaugh had crossed an ocean and buried themselves in one of the most remote valleys on Earth, only to realize that the Pinkertons were already knocking on the door. The globe had drastically shrunk. The realization that their bespoke suits and imported cattle could not insulate them from their past shattered the fragile discipline of the trio. Etta Place was the first to recognize the terminal trajectory of their situation. She understood that the peaceful ranch life was a temporary holding cell, and the walls were rapidly closing in. The stress of impending capture, the constant scanning of the horizon for armed posses, and the psychological deterioration of Longabaugh eroded her endurance. In 1906, escorted by Longabaugh, she returned to the United States. She boarded a train in San Francisco and vanished entirely from the historical record, a phantom who correctly calculated that remaining with the Wild Bunch guaranteed a violent death. Longabaugh returned to South America alone. The loss of Etta removed the final stabilizing element from the partnership. Parker and Longabaugh were forced to liquidate their Patagonian assets at a massive loss. They abandoned the cabin with the zinc roof, the cattle, and the carefully constructed facade of respectability. They were no longer wealthy expatriates. They were, once again, hunted men running for their lives. They fled north, crossing the rugged, freezing passes of the Andes, into the high-altitude desolation of Bolivia. The physical environment mirrored their psychological collapse. Bolivia was not the lush, fertile valley of Cholila. It was a harsh, oxygen-starved landscape of jagged rock, freezing winds, and deep, isolated mining camps. The physical toll of operating at altitudes exceeding 13,000 feet aged them rapidly. They were men approaching their mid-40s, their bodies battered by decades of harsh living and the constant corrosive drip of adrenaline. The capital they had stolen from the Union Pacific was exhausted. The proceeds from the hasty sale of the Argentine ranch dwindled. To survive in the freezing mountains, the men who had once terrorized the largest industrial monopolies in North America were forced to submit to the ultimate humiliating irony of their criminal careers. They required income, and the only skill they possessed was the application of specialized violence. They rode into the mining town of San Vicente and sought employment with the Concordia Tin Mine, a massive corporate extraction operation owned by foreign investors. The management, requiring men highly proficient with firearms to protect their assets from local bandits, hired the two aging Americans, Robert Leroy Parker, the architect of the Wild Bunch, and Harry Longabaugh, the lethal Sundance Kid, pinned on employee badges. They were handed company rifles. They were assigned to ride shotgun on the mule trains transporting the company payroll and raw silver across the desolate mountain passes. The dandy outlaws, who had once worn silk cravats and mocked the working class, were now reduced to wage laborers. They were risking their lives in the freezing mud of the Andes, earning a meager daily salary to protect the exact same corporate capital they had spent their entire lives violently attempting to steal. The capitalist machinery they had so arrogantly believed they could outsmart had finally absorbed them, grinding them down into disposable, anonymous security guards at the edge of the industrialized world. The psychological attrition was complete. All that remained was the physical termination. The illusion of legitimacy sustained by the Concordia Tin Mine evaporated in the freezing autumn of 1908. Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh, men who had once engineered the simultaneous robbery of multiple corporate trains across the American West, found themselves trapped in a cycle of subsistence labor. The meager wages of a payroll guard could not satisfy the psychological demands of men addicted to extreme immediate wealth. The discipline broke. They reverted to their primary programming. On the morning of November 4th, 1908, an administrator for the Aramayo Franchi and Company, Carlos Perot, was transporting the corporate payroll across the desolate, high-altitude terrain near the town of Tupiza. Perot was not flanked by a heavily armed Pinkerton detachment or secured within an iron-plated express car. He was accompanied only by his young son and a servant, leading a mule laden with 15,000 Bolivian pesos. Parker and Longabaugh ambushed the small party. The tactical execution was a pathetic echo of the Wild Bunch's former glory. There was no dynamite, no synchronized relay of thoroughbred horses. They simply leveled their rifles, demanded the saddlebags, and stole the company mule. It was an act of desperation, a localized highway robbery executed by aging men who had exhausted their strategic options. They fled northwest, navigating the jagged, oxygen-starved passes of the Andes, desperately seeking a route toward the Chilean border. The terrain was unforgiving, and their pace was sluggish. Unlike the vast, isolated canyons of Utah, where their network of bribed informants provided an impenetrable shield, the Bolivian landscape offered no sanctuary. The Aramayo Company immediately reported the theft, and the regional authorities mobilized a rapid military response. On the evening of November 6th, the two fugitives rode into the remote mining village of San Vicente. Situated at an elevation exceeding 14,000 feet, it was a desolate collection of mud brick structures clinging to the mountainside. Exhausted and suffering from the effects of altitude and the freezing temperature, they sought shelter in a small single-room adobe boarding house owned by a local resident named Bonifacio Salinas. They secured their stolen mule in the adjacent patio and retreated into the dark, unheated room to consume a meager meal. They were entirely unaware that a 4-man detachment of the Bolivian army, accompanied by the local police inspector, had tracked them to the village. As dusk settled over the mountains, a Bolivian patrol commanded by Captain Justo Concha surrounded the perimeter. When a soldier named Victor Torres approached the boarding house to interrogate the strangers, Parker and Longabaugh, operating on a hair trigger of paranoia, recognized the military uniform in the fading light. The response was instantaneous and fatal. A single shot was fired from the dark interior of the adobe house, striking Torres squarely in the chest and killing him instantly. The immediate area erupted into chaos. The remaining military personnel and local law enforcement established a perimeter around the boarding house. They did not attempt to negotiate. Armed with high-velocity Mauser rifles, the soldiers poured a concentrated barrage of suppressing fire into the structure, shattering the romantic slow-motion choreography manufactured by 20th century cinema. The reality of the San Vicente shootout manifested as a suffocating, brutal, and blindingly fast execution. The mud bricks of the boarding house provided marginal cover, but the heavy military rounds pulverized the adobe, filling the unventilated room with choking dust and razor-sharp fragments of debris. Parker and Longabaugh were trapped in a space no larger than a modern bedroom. There was no secondary exit. There were no horses waiting to carry them away. The geographical trap had snapped shut. The exchange of gunfire raged sporadically through the freezing night. The outlaws fired their Colts and Winchesters blindly into the darkness, attempting to keep the soldiers at bay. But the ammunition they carried was finite, and their tactical position was indefensible. Around midnight, the return fire from the boarding house slowed, became erratic, and finally ceased altogether. The Bolivian soldiers maintained their perimeter. They did not rush the structure. They waited in the freezing wind, their rifles trained on the doorway, until the first light of dawn illuminated the high peaks. When the authorities finally breached the shattered doorway of the boarding house, instead of two defiant heroes who died fighting for their freedom, the authorities discovered a forensic tableau serving as a grim testament to the absolute breakdown of the human spirit under extreme duress. Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, lay dead on the dirt floor. His body was severely mangled, bearing multiple gunshot wounds to the arms and torso sustained during the military barrage. The physical evidence and subsequent historical analysis suggest a harrowing sequence of events in the pitch black of the room. Longabaugh had been critically wounded, likely screaming in agony, rapidly bleeding out on the cold earth. Robert Leroy Parker, recognizing that the military would inevitably storm the room at dawn and that capture meant the gallows, made a final ruthless calculation. He retained the ultimate control over his syndicate to the very end. He placed the barrel of his revolver against the head of his suffering partner and pulled the trigger, administering a fatal coup de grace. Parker then turned the weapon on himself. He placed the muzzle against his own temple and fired. The dandy outlaws, the men who had posed in bespoke silk suits and mocked the financial institutions of North America, terminated their own lives, covered in mud, blood, and adobe dust. Their wealth, their vanity, and their complex psychological manipulations were ultimately reduced to a murder-suicide in a freezing windowless room thousands of miles from the empire they had attempted to exploit. The Bolivian authorities stripped the corpses of their weapons, their remaining currency, and any items of value. The bodies were unceremoniously loaded onto a cart and transported to the small, impoverished cemetery of San Vicente. The state did not provide coffins. The two most wanted men in the Western Hemisphere were dumped into a freshly dug, unmarked trench. They were buried alongside a deceased German miner, their physical remains swallowed by the barren earth. For nearly a century, the public refused to accept the pathetic reality of this conclusion. The mythology demanded a triumphant escape. Rumors proliferated that Parker had survived, returning to the United States to live out a quiet life under an assumed name. The refusal to acknowledge the dirt and the blood of San Vicente was a testament to the enduring power of the gentleman bandit illusion Parker had so carefully constructed. In 1991, science intervened to settle the historical ledger. Renowned forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow mounted an expedition to the high Andes, locating and excavating the specific grave in the San Vicente Cemetery believed to hold the remains of the outlaws. The team recovered skeletal fragments bearing distinct signs of violent trauma. The bones were transported back to the United States for rigorous modern forensic analysis. In 1993, the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeletal remains was cross-referenced against the genetic profiles of the living, verified relatives of Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh. The results were absolute and negative. The bones recovered from the San Vicente grave did not belong to Butch Cassidy or the Sundance Kid. They belonged to an unknown individual. The true location of the outlaws' remains within the shifting, desolate cemetery has been permanently lost. This scientific failure is the ultimate poetic punishment for the dandy outlaws. They had spent their entire adult lives aggressively seeking recognition, orchestrating their public image, and ensuring their exploits were documented in the press. They believed their intelligence and their violence granted them a permanent elevated status. Yet, the universe denied them even the basic dignity of a marked grave. They were completely erased by the landscape, transformed into anonymous ghosts. The legacy of the Wild Bunch is not a testament to freedom, but a forensic warning regarding the destructive nature of unchecked vanity and the manipulation of the vulnerable. Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh built a transient empire funded by the blood and trauma of working-class train crews and bank clerks. They utilized the poverty of Mormon farmers as a human shield, purchasing their safety with stolen gold coins that brought the wrath of the Pinkerton agency down upon innocent families. The $35,000 photograph taken in Fort Worth remains the defining artifact of their existence. It is not a symbol of style, but a document of their fatal arrogance. It proves that crime, when fueled by narcissism, meticulously engineers its own destruction. The bespoke suits and the silk cravats could not alter the fundamental geometry of the capitalist machinery they challenged. The violence they unleashed to sustain their opulent lifestyle created a reactionary force that hunted them across 2 continents, stripped them of their wealth, their allies, and their identities, and finally buried them in the freezing dust of history. The mask of the Robin Hood was torn away, leaving nothing but the reality of 2 desperate men who died alone in the dark.